Oh, greetings. Welcome to History of Economic Thought 2, Hillsdale College, and this is part 4 of our lecture on macroeconomics. And we're just having a little bit of my hand sanitizer here. We've got rational expectations pricing is going on now. Let's go ahead and pick up where we left off. And when we left off, we had Milton Friedman attacking Keynesianism and dealing at a blow with his monetarist theory. And then we mentioned that there was a problem with the stagflation that Keynesianism can't account for. Well, what follows then is the rational expectations revolution. If you were here last semester in History of Economic Thought 1, in my opening lecture, I mentioned a story about Robert Lucas talking about how if you walked into a seminar at a major economics program in a major university in the 1970s and said, "I'm not a Keynesian," people would start laughing as if, as a flat earther just came in. And Lucas says, if you walked into a seminar at the same school in the 1980s and said, "I'm a Keynesian," people would start laughing as if you were a flat earther. That's a pretty radical change. This is the story of why that change occurred and what happened. And it's the story of the rational expectations revolution and what's really the death of Keynesianism. Before I proceed with that, I should probably point out that when I say the death of Keynesianism, first of all, when you kill ideas, they can always come back. But secondly, I'm referring to academic economics. If you go into policy circles, that's different. Policy is frequently Keynesian, and those kinds of ideas are promoted. But in terms of academic, theoretical economics, there's a death blow, several death blows that are dealt to Keynesianism. That's what we're talking about. And so in theory, when it comes to economic theory, monetarism deals a tremendous blow and rational expectations deals the left hook that puts it down. But on the other hand, there's also the empirics, the monetary history, and the stagflation, and that's the kicked while down that does in Keynesianism. Well, the question for rational expectations revolution is this: how do people choose their actions? Well, all action is future directed, and so they must be forming expectations about the future and choosing accordingly. Okay, so how do people choose expectations? So, how do they form their expectations? How do people choose actions? And the answer is according to expectations for the future. This is crucial. All action, again, is future-oriented. And secondly, how do they form expectations? That's a difficult question. How do they form their expectations? Because that's going to trigger or determine, not trigger, but that should help to determine what their actions will be. And Keynes has an answer to that. Keynes says they're adaptive and they're driven by animal spirits, they're irrational, it's the beauty contest story. So for Keynes, we can say animal spirits is good enough for our purposes, but animal spirits, and they are also adaptive. And Milton Friedman argues for a kind of adaptive expectations. But keep in mind that for Keynes, people can be, there's a kind of fooling going on in the expectations where people can be fooled. They suffer from monetary illusion. That can stay forever in Keynes' view. So they're not adapting very well. Friedman, oh my gosh, what am I saying? Let's change that to adaptive with learning. They can actually begin to figure things out. Well, adapting expectations assume that people will observe events and data, and then they will assume that the past conditions or current conditions are what will hold. So in the Keynesian model, aggregate demand equals output, so there's no change, even if output is below the full employment level, or if there's an investor panic that generates loss of confidence. Loss of confidence leads to more panic leads to more loss of confidence, and it continues and continues and continues, and nobody thinks about, wait a minute, what's going to happen in the future? Maybe things will get better, or maybe that won't continue for some reason. Why do we model people as acting that way? Because that presumes that everybody else is stupider than the economist and can't learn. So the question for Mr. Keynes would be, well, why can't people pick up your book, The General Theory, read it and see what's happening, and then change their behavior? Read The General Theory. Oh, money illusion. Oh, I could change this behavior. Oh, the government's going to do that. I'll respond accordingly. Why don't they do that? Well, these kinds of expectations are adaptive expectations, are standard in the Keynesian model, but the question is, why don't people see in advance, figure this out, learn, and then move ahead and anticipate? So let's tell the story of rational expectations. And we're going to begin with John Muth. Muth was an economist at Carnegie Mellon University. He lived 1930 to 2005, 1930 to 2005, and he worked with Herbert Simon. They were doing studies of decision-making within firms, and they were trying to develop the kinds of decision-making rules that explain what firms were doing. And Herbert Simon argued that maybe we are assuming too much rationality on the part of firms, and he begins developing the idea of bounded rationality. But Muth said he had a different approach, and he said, maybe we're not assuming enough rationality. Maybe we should assume more. And in 1961, he wrote a paper, Rational Expectations and the Theory of Price Movements. And he said, in this paper, he argued that people's expectations should be the same thing that economic theory predicts. If economic theory predicts something will happen, people should be able to understand that. That is to say, they won't be adaptive. They won't suddenly see, here's the price, and we assume that, but the economist says it'll be something else in the future. The people ought to know what that something else is just as well. So his argument is that actors in the economy, individuals, expectations should be modeled as being the same as the predictions of economic theory. Great. They're not adaptive. Okay? In the real world, this is rational expectations. In forming expectations, people should use all publicly available data and all the history up to that point that's available. So when the economist is modeling those decision makers, if he's going to be consistent, he should model their expectations to include all public data, all the history, and the best available model of theory. That is, the one the economist is using. After all, the people could pick up his textbook or his paper and read it and learn it. So this is a consistency criterion. It keeps us from putting into our models the arrogance that the economist knows more than everybody else and everybody else is stupid. And it can be shown that the expected value forecast rules are the ones that satisfy this criteria. So when I wrote this down, we had an expectation operator. My little equation there shows that our guess for the price at time t plus 1, or this is actually, there it is, you figure it out. It shows that the expected value of the price is going to be conditioned upon all the omega, all the available information at that point in time. And so anyway, great, got that. Well, there's this arrogance that's involved, say, in the Keynesian story, that everybody else is stupid, but Keynes is smart. And this is rational expectations. So we'll put this, need to put that down. It's really the beginning of the rational expectations idea. And I'll abbreviate that RATEX. And the idea is this. In our models, expectations are formed by using all public data, anything that you could pick up the newspaper, for example, and read, all public history, everything that's happened up to that point, and finally, shall we just say, the best available models or theory. If you're a Keynesian, you should assume everybody understands Keynesian principles. If you're something else, you must understand that. Great. Okay. Well, this is a consistency criterion. And again, it can be shown that the expected value forecast works that. But here are a couple of caveats about this. The idea is not, it's not that people can't be mistaken or fooled, but rather they can't be systematically, regularly, consistently fooled in the same way. They will learn, they catch on. You can surprise people, but they will learn, and they'll learn according to theories. It's also important to recognize this is not the story that people have perfect information or that they're always right or that they even have correct expectations, because they don't, and unexpected things can happen. But they will form them, we think, expectations as best they can. It's not even the assumption that people have the same expectations, because arbitrage activity is enough to drive the market to a rational expectations equilibrium. Even if some people don't catch on, others can exploit that, and it should drive the market to a rational expectations equilibrium. Well, rational expectations, when Musk develops this, slowly gains ground in microeconomics, but in macroeconomics, the blows against Keynesianism and that come from stagflation and monetarism lead some people to look for a new approach to macro, and the Keynesian view of expectations just seems all wrong. And so there's this new approach, and it's pioneered by Robert Lucas, University of Chicago. He's a fellow undergraduate history major. Not that we went to the same school, but we both had our bachelor's degrees in history. And I'll tell a little bit of the story about Lucas. He's quite an interesting person. So Robert Lucas. So get his first name up. Robert Lucas, born 1937, and he's still alive and working today. But he received his Nobel Prize in 1995. Well, in the 1970s, he begins incorporating rational expectations into a dynamic general equilibrium model, and he uses this to begin building theory on Friedman and based on Friedman and other critics of Keynes. And Lucas says Keynesianism was a 40-year mistake. And so what I had to do was go back in the history of economic thought and see what the best alternative to Keynesianism at the time was to try and understand where Keynesianism went wrong. And when he goes back, he finds Hayek. And he finds a paper by Hayek from 1937. It's the year that he was born. And that paper is Economics and Knowledge. It's actually a speech that Hayek had given, reprinted as a paper. Economics and Knowledge. And it's it's a fascinating paper. I highly recommend it. But in it, Hayek defines equilibrium. He does a number of other things that I think are quite important. But what Lucas takes from it is Hayek's definition of equilibrium. And for Hayek, equilibrium must entail two things. And the first one is that every actor correctly anticipates the actions of the other actors. Every person correctly anticipates the actions of all other actors. Otherwise, it wouldn't be equilibrium. Somebody wanted, if I'd known you were going to do that, I would have done something different. I'd adjust. So if it's equilibrium, everyone is correctly anticipating each other. They have correct expectations about each other's actions, in other words. And secondly, I should probably point out in a minute, but secondly, everyone has correct anticipation of future events. Like, is it going to rain, snow? Well, there are some other kinds of things. Things apart from people's actions. Correct anticipations of various future events. Okay. That one right there is a Nash equilibrium condition. That is, nobody would change their behavior given what everybody else is doing. And this is one that, with regard to exogenous and external events, we have correctly anticipated them. Those are the two conditions. And, says Hayek, we can imagine that as being something that holds through time. People have plans, they've decided what they will do, and so as long as those two things are not disrupted, then we're in equilibrium, and it's a dynamic or intertemporal time equilibrium through time. And that equilibrium will be sustained until something unexpected happens. It will disrupt or falsify the expectations, and then people will be shocked. There'll be a shock or a change, and people have to reformulate their plans, do something new. So we can see equilibrium as being a time path or a sequence of actions and correct expectations. That's what Lucas takes from Hayek. There's much more in the Hayek paper, but that's what he takes. This is why Lucas then says the evenly rotating economy of Ludwig von Mises is an early prototype of a rational expectations equilibrium, because it's a system in which we've achieved equilibrium and everyone keeps doing the same thing over and over and over, producing the same goods because they found the optimal amount. Everything's perfectly adjusted until some shock comes and changes. They have to move to a new equilibrium. So it's a process in motion. Well, Lucas and others begin developing rational expectations macroeconomics, and this sweeps macro. That's why in the 1980s you can walk in to a seminar and people laugh if you're an old Keynesian. This takes off. Other players who are quite important in this story are Neil Wallace. All of these people are Nobel Prize winners and still alive. He was born 1939. And then also Thomas Sargent. Thomas Sargent, so I misspelled his name. Thomas Sargent, 1943. Great. Well, this sweeps economics, and this is why Lucas tells his economics seminar story. And it gives rise to modern macroeconomic modeling and theory. And modeling is really the story of how macroeconomic models will be constructed. And then the theory, that's the driving assumptions that are put into the models. So this rational expectations revolution, the Ratex revolution or rational expectations revolution, is one in modeling. And again, modeling is how we're going to construct a model of the macroeconomy. A model macroeconomy. And then theory itself, those would be driving assumptions that are put into the model. The driving assumptions, and then we will get implications and results based on those and how we built the model. Now, strangely enough, in some respects, macroeconomics also almost becomes just a set of modeling exercises. But here's what we get out of here's what macroeconomics, macro modeling becomes. And the first thing that these models tend to include, macro modeling, first thing we'll put in will be microfoundations. There's an attempt to link macroeconomics back to microeconomics. That is to say, we're not only going to talk about aggregates, but try to talk about the underlying behavior. And so these will involve what is often called a representative agent. Suppose the average person looks like such and such. So there'll be an average consumer or an average investor or something like that. Typically, the representative agent is an average consumer and the behavior of the consumer. And then there will also try to put in, typically, multiple markets and general equilibrium. So we've got many different output markets and many different factor markets. And we'll try to include those in those are the microfoundations. For expectations, we have, first of all, there will be inherent uncertainty. We don't know the future, but we're going to model that as being probability distributions over possible events. Inherent uncertainty is modeled as probability distributions over possible future events, and expectations will be formed rationally, forward-looking, and try to use all of the information and the best models and those sorts of things. Other features of these of this approach is that the models will be dynamic. That is to say, we're not talking about an equilibrium at a point in time, but an equilibrium that might hold over a long periods of time. It's dynamic. So we'll put that here. Dynamic, and that means that today's decision influences tomorrow's decision problem. What we do today will set up the problem for tomorrow, for the future. So we have to take all of that into account. It's a chain of decisions over time. Influences tomorrow's decision problem. Great. And that means that we are engaged in, people are engaged in multi-period planning and decision-making. If I make a decision today, it's for all the way forward, in other words, until something disrupts my plan. Solutions to these multi-period planning decisions or problems will be solutions if we're choosing, say, an optimal consumption basket. We're not choosing a basket, we're choosing a series of baskets. we're not choosing an optimal investment, but a series of investments, etc., over time. So solutions will be sequences or time paths of variables representing the optimal choices that we make. And the methods used to solve these things are mathematically difficult. They tend to be. Things like dynamic programming, optimal control theory, etc. I'm not going to work through any problem like that. The closest that I've come to it was when I wrote down, if you go back to our first lecture on Leon Walras, first lecture, where I talked about a general equilibrium setting with all the different markets and things being in equilibrium at the same time. All we have to do is take that model and add a time path to it and uncertainty in the case of probability distributions, and that becomes a general equilibrium, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. And finally, we have our fourth point is equilibrium modeling. Equilibrium, and that means within a single period and over the whole time path. Great. Now, that's a lot of stuff. What can we say about it? It's a modeling approach. And in some respects, what become schools of macroeconomics become assumptions that are being put into models. And while people are somewhat divided into schools, it's very possible for an economist to say, well, I'm going to treat this with a new classical model or this with a new Keynesian model. One can pick and choose among these models and try different things. So here's what these ideas mean. Let me give you a couple of the schools of thought here. And one is the new classical. New classical is really what is pushed by Robert Lucas and I think also by Neil Wallace, Patrick Keogh, Robert Barrow. I guess we'll put those names up in a minute. But new classical economics, as they call it, new, not neo, is a macro school. And typically what they use in building these kinds of models, when they put in many markets, what they assume is perfect competition. So they assume that all the markets are perfectly competitive. And rapid, I guess we shall say, or perfect even, clearing of the markets. They clear. If there's a shock to the system, markets still will clear, move back in. And so with these models, the implication is that Keynesian-style policies cannot help. They can only hurt. That's the implication, is that Keynesian remedies can only hurt. They just make things worse. Get out of the way. And this would be people like Lucas, Robert Barrow of Harvard, Neil Wallace, who I'd mentioned, Patrick Keogh falls into this group. He's at University of Minnesota, and others. Great. That's one approach to using this macro modeling. Another approach, another set of assumptions, would be the new Keynesian. And when the new classical economics, led by Lucas, began to take over economics, some of the people who thought there was a bigger role for government were a bit, they responded. And they developed a different twist on this kind of modeling. That's new Keynesian economics. New Keynesian modeling involves the following. It assumes sticky wages and prices. You might think that there are adjustment costs, transaction costs. It's slower to adjust than this model. Markets will clear, but it might take a while because of menu costs, transaction costs, other kinds of things. They also tend to model with things like assumptions like monopolistically competitive markets. If you go back to our second competition lecture, when we talked about monopolistic competition, this is the kind of model, such as developed by Chamberlain, that they assume that firms will have some market power, there will be entry and exit, but some market power, and that helps to account for some of the failure to change in prices. Implication of this kind of an approach is that Keynesian policies might help. Especially monetary policy, because they have to take Friedman into account. And I guess we could also say, and maybe not. Maybe it won't help at all. And so for examples of this, we have people like famous economists. Michael Woodford is one. There are many people who we could put in to this category, but Michael Woodford, Larry Cristiano, also at the University of Minnesota, and I think Sergei Rebello, who's at Northwestern University. Another one who's interesting is John Taylor at Stanford, because John Taylor uses new Keynesian models to say that government interference in the economy won't help. Tends to make things worse. Now, some people, as I hope to clear here, some people just treat these as being different models that they can use to test ideas rather than being whole schools of thought in themselves. Some of them really do fit into a school of thought, but some say, these are just different kinds of models that we can use for different testing purposes. I think that most people in economics, most macroeconomists today, would take this approach, and in some ways you can see why. The idea of quickly, rapidly adjusting prices may not hold in an economy. That seems a little hard perhaps to swallow. There's agreement in these two camps on a few things, and one is that the long-run effect of money is neutral. Monetarism is more or less right. Maybe not the monetarist policy they don't agree with, but they agree that monetarism and Friedman are right in that regard. Neutrality, long-run neutrality of money won't influence the economy. In the short run, the new classicals argue that markets work almost perfectly. They work perfectly, and so stability policy that the government puts in will be useless at best, or it will be harmful. Whereas the new Keynesians argue that markets don't adjust instantly, they're maybe not perfectly competitive, and maybe government intervention in the short run can help. Interesting how these models can be used in debates. Because in the 2008, the debate over the 2008 financial crisis, debate was actually in 2009, question was, did the Federal Reserve policy cause the problem? And using new Keynesian models, Ben Bernanke, a new Keynesian, said, no, the Fed was not at fault. And John Taylor, another new Keynesian, said, yes, absolutely, the Fed caused this, it's the Fed's fault, and the government should stay out. And of course, both of them are new Keynesians. And Keynesians themselves, real Keynesians, Keynes would probably not have approved of this, and certainly real Keynesians, old Keynesians, don't like any of this stuff. So that's where we are. There are some Austrian critiques of all this, and so I'll finish up with that. One question that Austrians and others have is, well, what's this about a representative agent? The differences of behavior in different people might be important. The representative agent assumption might not be true to what goes on in the economy. Another problem is that, for the most part, there's an absence of serious capital theory in any of this. Nothing about the heterogeneity, the specificity, the wrong kinds of capital being invested in, the malinvestment that was in the Austrian business cycle theory. This also assumes complete knowledge, not perfect information, but there will be no sheer ignorance, no black swans or something like that. And it also assumes equilibrium. What if you're outside of equilibrium? Can you address these questions? So those are Austrian critiques. For responding to those, one thing that's being done now, and this is quite new, is agent-based computational models, where very complex computational models of an economy using heterogeneous agents, different kinds of people in an economy, can be modeled on a computer to see if it can get you the kind of results that might make more sense might be able to model or duplicate an economy. There are some models with respect to the capital specificity question. Some new Keynesian models have begun to incorporate things like that. And Ricardo Caballero at MIT has been working specifically on capital specificity and the irreversibility or the difficulty of capital heterogeneity, difficulty of changing a capital structure. As far as the problem of no sheer ignorance, no black swans, well, Aldo Rusticchini, who was at, I think he's still at University of Minnesota, he used to be at NYU, Salvador Modica, have adopted ideas that came from the cybernetics, from the computer science literature on unawareness, and they've been incorporating that into economics. And that's the same concept that the Austrians have as sheer ignorance. So in some of these areas, maybe the future will bring some sort of progress. Currently, I think the Austrian contributions are pretty minimal to to macroeconomics, but that's where macroeconomics stands today. There's a very nice pair of cartoon books, graphic novels, comics, that have been written by an economist. One is on macro and one is on micro. And they're both great, but the micro book, you read through it and it's great. It presents micro in terms of its comic strip. You read the macro and you get to the end of the macro and it says, macroeconomics is unlike micro. It's completely unsettled. 100 years from now, microeconomics will probably look a lot like it does today. And macroeconomics, and it has a picture of a guy flying in a rocket pack on his back, wearing a helmet, shouting, "I'm an Austro-Minskyite." Minsky is somebody we're not going to cover today, who believes kind of probably closer to behavioral economics. But at any rate, that's macro. And I guess my final closing thought is that, isn't it interesting how these guys imagine this stuff and how creative they are? And maybe someday we'll even understand the macroeconomy.